Okay, right, so the next function we're looking at here is one that I have enabled offset contrast. Now this is a specific, or sort of a new type of contrasting that the engine doesn't offer naturally, that I find is really useful when dealing with height map data. So if we just open this up, simple function, and again we'll go into detail about how we make this and what this is doing in the work examples as well. But we might remember we talked about using power as a way of adding contrast. And if we have a look, this very much will do that. Value of 1 being adding no contrast, value of 2 upping the contrast. 4, you can see we're definitely getting more contrast between our values, and this is great, this definitely works, but it's not always the best way to add contrast, I find, or not always the most suitable for what we're doing. The engine does come with a function called cheap contrast, and what this does is it adds contrast. So in this case it adds contrast with power by blending or by adjusting the grayscale values, leaving black and white where they are, and it works a bit like a levels or a curves control would in Photoshop. Cheap contrast works by clamping the range or compressing the range down. If I plug in control for this as well, so no cheap contrast is just the image as imported. If I add some cheap contrast, what this is doing is it's bringing the black level up and it's bringing the white level down. And as you start to bring more and more values in here, higher values, you effectively end up with a black and white image, which is definitely one way of adding a lot of contrast, but it isn't necessarily useful. If this was a height map, you always want to have some grayscale values in your height map, and so not necessarily the best for what we're doing here, or for when you're doing kind of height map blending. Similarly, power control, it is adding more contrast, but it also heavily darkens the image because everything starts within 0 to 1, and so when you power it a lot, it's all getting compressed towards the darks. And what the offset contrast does is tries to kind of mitigate those things. So it's a way of adding quite a lot of contrast, but without ending up with everything being quite dark and in that dark range. So if I bring in some values here, I'm just going to show what it does first. So with a value of 0, again, not adding any contrast, that's the image as we imported it. If I start adding a little bit, 0.2, 0.3, what it's doing is it's bringing the range of the input down by this offset value. So effectively we're subtracting 0.3 from every pixel, and then it's clamping that out. So anything that started 0.3 grey or lower is now going to be pure black. And then to compensate for that, we're multiplying the top of the range by however much it needs to get back to have the white values to get back to 1 at the top. If I open this up, it's pretty simple setup really. Subtracting the offset, and then we're doing 1 minus the offset and 1 over the offset, so it's the reciprocal of the inverse. And what that means is if we are, say, subtracting 0.25, we would then be multiplying by 4. So 1 minus 0.25 is 0.75, 1 over 0.75 is 4, and so the highest value here, if we start at white, we subtract 0.25, we multiply by 4, is that right? Yes, we're multiplying by 1 over 4, and so we're getting back to a value of 1 at the top range. And we have a look at this as the function on the graph. So with an input here of just a linear gradient, value from 0 to 1, if I change my offset input, if I offset by 0.1, effectively we're just clamping this bottom value and bringing that down. So we've subtracted 0.25 and then we've multiplied the curve or the gradient back up again to get this end back up to white. And this is really useful for working with height map data, I find, and we'll see a lot of this when we do our vertex blending, height map blending for landscapes, those kinds of things. If you think about how water fills up in puddles and cracks, it fills up the base, and anything which is high stays high, and that's effectively what this is doing here. So to compare that with a contrast, so I take my linear gradient and power it. Let's to see it as a graph. So again, power of 1, we get our straight line. If we power by 2, it's affecting the greys in the middle, but keeping black and white the same. But you can see everything's being pulled down towards darkness, or towards low values. And so I find this isn't as much control for height maps as I want for when I'm doing height map blending. And if I change to keep contrast, again using the linear gradient as an input, if I set that to 0, my linear gradient, as I start bringing that in, it's compressing the values to the middle. So all 3 different ways of adding contrast, they all do increase or change the ratios between blacks and whites, but not necessarily in a way that makes sense. If this was a height map and we do a keep contrast to it, we're going to get a lot of hard edges in the middle, but that's not what I want. I want to keep the high levels the same, the top ranges, the highest points the same, and add contrast by removing the low ranges, and that's what this function does. Okay.